We have the pleasure of being joined by Georgia Tech play-by-play broadcaster Andy Demetra. Andy, the biggest thing that Georgia Tech has done so far this year, we're just talking about a little bit off the air. The experience in Dublin, Ireland, the first game at number 10 Florida State in Ireland. What was it like traveling back and forth and kind of that experience in Ireland for that couple days?
It was a whirlwind, and then it had a very storybook finish. This was actually my second time calling a game in Dublin. I started at Georgia Tech in 2016, so my first ever game as voice of the Yellow Jackets was in that Aer Lingus College Football Classic against Boston College. But, the team red-eyed. We arrived in Dublin on a Thursday morning. The game was Saturday late afternoon local time. So you're hitting that ground running. Your body clock is all thrown off, but I think for all the Georgia Tech fans who came overseas, who watched the team in person, to see Georgia Tech play that way and for that game to end the way it did, I don't know if it's possible to drink Dublin dry, but I'm sure Georgia Tech tested that theory after the game. Great way to start the season, very memorable, but as you know, a win is only as good as the follow-up, so it's good to see Georgia Tech handle its business in what could have been a trap-ish game versus Georgia State here last Saturday at home. So 2-0, good start, long season left, but a good solid start for Georgia Tech.
And Andy, before we, touch on this season and this upcoming matchup between Syracuse and Georgia Tech, I just want to look back at last season and on top of that Florida State game. How passionate has this fan base for Georgia Tech been with their success recently?
Well, as you know, it had been a bleak previous couple of years as Georgia Tech tried to find its way. They hired Brent Key as the interim head coach 4 games into the 2022 season, led them to a 4-4 finish. He got the full-time job, and then there were some bouts of inconsistency from Georgia Tech last year. I think everybody would acknowledge that. You have wins like at Miami and North Carolina when the Tar Heels were ranked. They gave Georgia all they could handle, but that was also balanced out by some pretty shoddy performances like Bowling Green at home and Boston College. And so I think that's sort of that next step that Georgia Tech needed to take to certify itself as a tough program in the ACC, is being a week in and week out consistent ball club. And I think we're starting to see maybe some elements of that here through 2 games of this 2024 season. The one thing that Georgia Tech fans have really embraced is Brent Key is one of their own. He played here at Georgia Tech. He got his start as a GA at Georgia Tech. In fact, his very first game as a coach in his career was in 2001 against Syracuse at the Meadowlands when he was GA for George O'Leary. So I'm sure this may mark a full circle moment for Brent coming up to Central New York this weekend. But Brent is somebody who has so much passion and conviction for Georgia Tech, what it stands for, and what this program can be, because he was here during some of the halcyon days of Georgia Tech football, and he knows what it takes and what a Georgia Tech program should look like. And I think you're starting to see him put his identity onto this team, the toughness, the way they play, very much built in his own image. And so Georgia Tech fans have certainly fallen behind that. They've loved what they've seen from Brent Key. There's a little extra credibility when it comes from one of your own. And so if you're looking at Q ratings among head coaches in the ACC, Brent Key is probably at the top of the list right now. Like I said, long way to go, but I think there's a proof of concept that Georgia Tech fans have seen from Brent Key as head coach of this Yellow Jackets team. And now it's just about taking that next step.
It sounds like Brent Key has some, fun success against Syracuse. His first game as a GA against Syracuse clinches the bowl game against Syracuse last season. Focusing on this season a little bit, a lot of returning starters, 16 total, 83% of the offensive production coming back. First 2-0 start to the year since 2016 with the wins over number 10 Florida State and Georgia State. Speaking of this year comparative to last, what have we learned about this team through the first 2 weeks that you maybe were question marks coming into the year?
I think it's going to be a sturdier defense. There was really nowhere to go but up for Georgia Tech last year when they finished near the bottom nationally in rush defense. So they brought in Tyler Santucci as defensive coordinator. He spent last season as the DC at Duke, led the Blue Devils to the top scoring defense in the ACC. And while it is a small sample size, I think you see a galvanized Georgia Tech defense, particularly up front. They do have some returning pieces there, but we're still all sort of learning together what makes a Tyler Santucci defense, but I think they're just much stouter at the line of scrimmage, getting contact on backs before the line of scrimmage. That's been encouraging so far. Last year, Georgia Tech, they were able to mask some of their weaknesses in stopping the run because they forced a ton of takeaways. They were ninth nationally in total turnovers. I don't think they need to be as reliant on forcing turnovers as they have been the last couple of seasons. I think they have a really good linebacker in Kyle Eifert. That much is evident. Already 23 tackles on the season. And so, with Marlo Wax, having that solid anchor at middle linebacker means so much to a defense. I think they're just better armored up front with their depth and with some of the individual talent and with a new scheme and new philosophy with Tyler Santucci. I think that's a big ingredient to this 2-0 start. And we'll see how it continues to unfold. But if Georgia Tech just can make some incremental gains on defense, they don't need to have a 180-degree turn, but if they could just make some incremental improvements on defense combined with all those starters they have back on offense, a returning quarterback in Haynes King, a returning all-ACC running back in Jamal Haynes, and 4 offensive line starters, I think you can kind of see the foundation for Georgia Tech to be able to make that next move up in the ACC.
So you're looking at the defense, you're impressed by that, but on the offensive end, Georgia Tech has run the ball so well of late. What has made this running game such an important factor for the team?
A really beguiling running offense. You'll see on Saturday a lot of pre-snap motion, mass formation changes, a lot of 12 personnel sets with 2 tight ends. Buster Faulkner loves to use his tight ends on those sliders, almost as additional blockers. With Jamal Haynes, you have somebody that was honorable mention all ACC at running back after converting from slot receiver in the offseason. He is a diminutive, dangerous guy who's a solid pass catcher out of the backfield. You would expect that from somebody who began as a slot receiver, but he runs downhill and brings his pads as well. He's really a fun running back to watch. And then also you have to respect Haynes King as a running threat. He's got that long stride and can get to the edge, pulling out some of those meshes. And it is very much a central part of the running attack of Georgia Tech. So it's a very balanced offense. It's an offense that can really have defenses flat-footed because of how much pre-snap motion and eye candy they have to account for. And I think also the second year under offensive coordinator Buster Faulkner, there's just a comfort level now that you're seeing with Georgia Tech where they know what they can do. They feel very self-assured and in what they can run in order to get that ball downfield. Their ability to grind out double-digit play drives, I think, has been impressive so far, in a continuation of what we saw last year. And so, yeah, it's an impressive offense. And when you have 8 returning starters on that offense, you're able to hit that ground running and click really early.
And with Syracuse, this is a team against Ohio in week 1. They gave up a lot of rushing yards. I think it was almost over 200. So since, the rushing defense for Syracuse looks a little vulnerable, do you expect Georgia Tech to really focus on the running game, or do you think they'll still go with that balanced offense approach?
Well, I think you have to lean into your identity. And Georgia Tech led the ACC in rushing last year, which I think would throw a lot of ACC fans off guard when they hear that. Yeah, when Georgia Tech had Paul Johnson as his head coach, you could just stamp that in ink that, yeah, Georgia Tech would lead the ACC in rushing. But that was their identity last year. And I think it all stems from their ability to establish the run. And that's when you can start stressing the perimeters of defense with screen passes to Malik Rutherford or some shot plays to Eric Singleton Jr., who I wouldn't say has had a quiet first 2 weeks, but what's made the start to Georgia Tech impressive is that they haven't had to lean too much on Eric Singleton Jr. and his speed. The other part of this game is that Georgia Tech does like to use sort of what are essentially runs, just with pop passes and screens to the perimeter. But yeah, I would think that Georgia Tech would be wise to lean on its offensive line to clear some holes, to get 190 rushing yards against a very stout front four in Florida State. Kind of shows you that they feel very confident that they can run the ball consistently and soundly. And I think whether it was whether Syracuse held Ohio to negative rushing yards or what they did, I don't think that would probably change their approach and them being a run first, run I wouldn't say dominant team, but a run-first team come Saturday.
You mentioned the running game, and obviously it starts with the offensive line. They've also been good in the pass blocking game as well. They haven't allowed a sack yet this year. Least sacks allowed last year in the ACC. What do you think about the offensive line? Does it not get enough love with how good they have been the last 2 years with the running game and pass blocking?
So it's an interesting question. I think they get the love here at Georgia Tech. I don't know if there is known a commodity if you talk about collective offensive line groups around the ACC, but the facts are the facts. Tech led the ACC in rushing last year. Like you said, they led the ACC in fewest sacks allowed per game. You get 4 of those starters back, and then you plug in a first-team All-Conference USA right guard at Keelan Rutledge. This team's successful, and it all stems from that offensive line. You know it has to make Brent Key's heart skip a beat, being a former offensive lineman himself. So I think they're a proven offensive line group. Maybe not as known around the ACC, but you put it all together, it shouldn't surprise anyone that Georgia Tech can be a dominant running team, given the experience they have back on offensive line, 2 returning all ACC linemen, a lot of returning career starts, and yeah, they're as proven an offensive line group as you may see around the ACC.
So now to the man that's behind that offensive line, Haynes King. Good quarterback, but you look at his stats, the first thing that my eyes jump to is the turnovers. 15 interceptions last year. He only has 1 so far this season. How's he looked in the pocket and throwing the ball accurately?
Yeah, so Haynes King, he led the ACC in touchdown passes last year with 27, but he did lead the ACC in interceptions. And of the 16 that he threw last year, 10 of those were in losses. And so I think a lot of that was due to him having to press a bit when Georgia Tech was playing from behind. And Brent told me that too often last year, they relied too much on asking Haynes to, hey, go out and make a play. And maybe that accounted for some of those turnovers. That is an area, though, that he does need to clean up. But, Haynes also had one of the best years of Georgia Tech quarterbacks in history in total offense. He is a true dual threat, a really good runner, manipulating that mesh on the outside zone. He can throw some dots downfield, and he's got options with Malik Rutherford and Eric Singleton Jr. And Chase Lane. He's got a pretty well-rounded receiving core that he can throw to, and he's your prototypical coach's son who just knows how to command a huddle, knows how to command a locker room. I think he has to make sure he's not throwing as many high leverage passes like he was forced to do last year. But I think with that blocking he's getting, you're going to get the best version of Haynes King. And so, yeah, obviously turnovers, that was the priority number 1 for Haynes heading into this season. I think he's started to address that. But I think he's somebody who's tailor-made for this Buster Faulkner offense. And Brent Key, he didn't shy from the hype. He said at ACC Media Days, he believes Haynes King can be not just the best quarterback in the ACC, but among the best quarterbacks in the country. He was a great pull from the transfer portal, and I think Georgia Tech derives a lot of confidence from what they're getting from number 10.
Brian Brown would agree about his quarterback, sending a bottle of champagne over to Ohio State's Ryan Day for allowing Kyle McCord to come to Syracuse. One thing that Kyle McCord has struggled with last year and maybe a little bit in the first game is being under pressure. He's the bottom 10 quarterback when he was under pressure last season. Georgia Tech has struggled a little bit putting pressure on quarterbacks last season and a little bit in the first couple of games. Is that a concern right now on the defensive side of the ball, putting pressure on opposing quarterbacks?
I don't think it's been a concern yet. And yeah, they only have 1 sack. They had a sack wiped out by a face mask penalty as well versus Florida State. I think what you've seen a little bit of these first 2 weeks is Georgia Tech has been able to collapse the pocket, but they're over pursuing and allowing those escape valves for quarterbacks on scrambles, whether it was Uiagalelei or Christian WAER. He got some 4th down scrambles against pressure for Georgia State last week. So I think you're seeing some pass rushing from Georgia Tech. That has been just a sore subject for Georgia Tech fans probably for a decade, is the lack of a consistent pass rush. I think they have some capable pass rushers. Rometto Height has had an impressive first 2 games. Their transfer from Southern Cal and Auburn. I think you have good bull rushers up the middle with Micaiah Scott and Zeke Biggers. So there are good building blocks of Georgia Tech being a solid pass rushing team. It hasn't quite materialized or manifested yet in their sack totals, but I think they're trending in the right direction. And you also look at the amount of TFLs that they've gotten too. They've been able to get contact on running backs and force those negative plays. You know, again, it's not just all about sacks. It's about getting those negative plays as well. And from that standpoint, Georgia Tech has checked that box through the first 2 games. It is still a bit of an unknown to this point what the story will be on Georgia Tech and its sack generation in 2024. But I think Tech fans feel pretty sanguine that they're going to be an improved pass rushing team this year.
For Kyle McCord, if he's going to get sacked or if he's going to throw an interception, who on that Georgia Tech defense is going to be making those kind of plays?
Like I mentioned earlier, Romello Height, and as I like to joke, it wasn't just our punter, David Shanahan, the native of Ireland. We also had a native of Dublin, Georgia, in Romello Height, who was with us on that trip against Florida State. And then also Kevin Harris II. He's the guy who began his career at Alabama, was a high 4-star guy, transferred back to Georgia Tech. He's kind of had to bide his time, but physically he's got that potential as a speed rusher. Got a sack against Florida State. It's kind of surprising to me that Kevin Harris only has 2 career sacks because he just seems capable of so much more. I think as he grows into this season, he could be a pass rushing threat. The physical potential is there, but now can you convert that into actual on-field production? Those are the 2 guys that I think will stand out as Georgia Tech's top 2 sack-generating threats. So do watch out for Romello Height, number 9, Kevin Harris, number 11.
Mentioning that defense, what is the kind of the defensive game plan going against Syracuse? What has Georgia Tech kind of done well? You mentioned the tackles for loss, getting in the backfield, that they'll look to do against Syracuse this upcoming weekend.
I don't know if Tyler Santucci would be in favor of me spilling the game plan on a podcast. So I don't know. And unfortunately, I'm not in those defensive game planning meetings. So I couldn't give you a concrete answer on what I think Georgia Tech's defensive strategy will be. But I think their ability to get off the field on 3rd down will have to be key. I think that's key for any defense, but Georgia Tech really struggled in that area last year. They know they need to be more efficient on 3rd down. They just can't have a lot of busts or broken tackles as well. We started to see a little bit of broken tackles seep in for the Yellow Jackets last Saturday versus Georgia State, so they need to wrap and squeeze well. They need to be sound. I think they've got really good defensive backs in Amari Harvey on one end and Warren Burrell on the other. They have a veteran safety tandem in Lamiles Brooks and Clayton Powell-Lee. So on the back end, they've got some experience, but they just got to make sure they get off that field on 3rd down. As you know, Syracuse is still in the process of gathering confidence offensively and being able to muster sustained drives. That can really help accelerate that confidence building process. And so for Georgia Tech, not necessarily 3 and outs, but they need to be able to stall out drives. I think that was a key aspect of their win versus Florida State. They forced Florida State into those no man's land areas inside Tech territory, but they forced 3rd down stops and forced them into some really long field goals. And Georgia Tech last week versus Georgia State, twice Georgia State had 1st and goals from the 3 and in, and they got 3 total points out of that. So the Yellow Jackets have shown the ability to bow up when the situation demands it. And I think they'll need to be consistent in that area again on Saturday.
So Dublin is certainly a road game. There's no denying that, but this will be Georgia Tech's first real road atmosphere. Dome is a little remodeled. It's a little different. How do you think they're going to handle an away atmosphere based on how they played on the road last year?
Yeah, not only that, but, Syracuse has been a good September team here these last few years. And so, beating Florida State, it was a different environment for everybody. You could argue it was a partisan Florida State crowd, but at the end of the day, it was still neutral site. So this is the first true road game atmosphere for Georgia Tech. And on top of that, as we're recording this, we don't know what the rankings will hold. That target could get a little bigger for Georgia Tech as they head to the Dome, depending on what the voters think, giving Georgia Tech a ranking. And I don't think that's beyond the realm of possibility. So it's going to test that maturity of this Yellow Jacket team. But I think you do take confidence knowing that you do have, like you said, those 16 returning starters And they were able to go to Miami last year when Miami was ranked and undefeated. And you can say what you want about the quote unquote home field atmosphere at Hard Rock Stadium, but you're still coming out of your comfort zone and having to get that win. And so, it may not come into play here, but Brent Key is also 5-0 against ranked ACC opponents. So I think he does a good job of delivering the right message to his team, facing opponents that, have to be respected. So we'll see. But yeah, no, the Dome. And if anybody needs any insight on that team of what kind of atmosphere Georgia Tech will step into this Saturday, and they can always ask me, because I was there, if not in the booth as a student, but down in the stands. So I think they come into the Dome on Saturday with a healthy amount of respect for the road challenge that this presents.
Yeah, you mentioned we're recording this on Monday, so the poll has not come out yet because of Boston College and Florida State playing later tonight. Georgia Tech, you mentioned undefeated against ranked ACC teams. Syracuse won't be one. Georgia Tech has the possibility, and obviously you're a WAER alum. Do you have a favorite experience in the Dome back from your student days?
So I was joking about this with my wife. So this is actually going to be the first football game that I will have attended at the Dome since literally my senior year. So we're talking, gosh, 20 plus years. And so the last game that I attended, it was Parents Weekend. It was against Virginia Tech. They were ranked. I was there in the stands watching with my parents. The game goes to overtime. I turn to my parents and I say, if Syracuse wins this game, I'm storming the field. Syracuse wins. I ditch my parents. I rush onto the field, leave them completely in the dust. So that's probably my last good memory of being at the Dome, at least for a football game. But of course, my senior year also coincided with Carmelo Anthony and Jerry McNamara's freshman year. So have a lot of fond memories when they flipped that court over for basketball. But definitely look forward to a Dome Dog and a trip down memory lane this Saturday. And hopefully I don't have too many delinquent parking passes. I don't want to get a knock on the door of our broadcast booth in the Bursar's office midway through the game. So hopefully everything is on the up and up in my long-awaited return to the Dome for football.
Well, I can tell you the Dome now has air conditioning, which is always an improvement, and 5G if you have Verizon only, I'm pretty sure at this moment of time.
I believe I do have Verizon. I have already told our broadcast crew, for whom this will be their maiden voyage to the Dome, that you don't it's not going to be a Turkish bath on a Saturday in early September in Syracuse. It'll be nice and breezy down there.
For sure. Thank you again for taking the time, Andy.
Appreciate that. Thanks, guys.